I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Lucas Schwartz has been a park and historic specialist with the Missouri State Museum since December 2015, providing interpretation on a variety of topics relevant to Missouri's history and natural resources. Lucas obtained a BA in archaeology from Washington University in St. Louis and an MA in anthropology from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Lucas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So if we're all ready, I'll go ahead and share the screen here. All right. Now, one thing you might be asking is, okay, why Vincent Price? I work for the Missouri State Museum, and Vincent's kind of this big Hollywood name. Well, we started doing this interpretive program called Trailblazers, which we talk about famous Missourians. And one of the things I was kind of surprised to learn about when I began looking into famous Missourians was that Vincent Price is actually from St. Louis. Why did I personally pick Price? Well, I grew up seeing him in Edward Scissorhands and heard him in Michael Jackson's Thriller. And also, I'm just personally a fan of horror films. So, of course, once I started researching those Trailblazers and discovered he was from St. Louis, I jumped on the opportunity to do a program on him. Now, in addition to being, pretty famous for his horror films, I also wanted to share some of his story because I learned a lot of different things about the man. Not only was he a trailblazer in film, creating these really debonair yet sympathetic villains, but he was also a trailblazer in bringing fine arts to the public eye and in cooking. Now, Vincent Price, like I said, he was born in St. Louis, May 27th, 1911. And he was kind of dubbed the Candy Kid while he was living out there because his father was Vincent Leonard Price Sr., and he ran the National Candy Company in St. Louis. Now, they were already a fairly well-to-do family in St. Louis because his grandfather, Vincent Clarence Price, had invented the first cream of tartar baking powder, Dr. Price's baking powder. He'd also developed several different types of cereals, experimented with food flavoring extracts. So the whole family is really tied in with food. And the National Candy Company got established in St. Louis by Vincent Leonard Price Sr. right around 1904 because he'd heard that the World's Fair was going to be happening in St. Louis, and he figured that'd be a good place to set up a booth to help advertise the company. Now, they specialized in what were called penny candies. It's very, very cheap, easy to access candies, which is one of the very few things people could afford during the Depression, which is what helped keep the candy company afloat. Now, that ended up being pretty good for Vincent Jr. because he was in college during the Depression, and his father had actually had to drop out of college due to a stock market crash back in the 1800s. But thanks to the business acumen of his father, he was able to stay in college in the 1930s stock market crash. Now, there were a lot of signs of his three big passions early on in his life. Of course, as I mentioned, food was a family tradition. But growing up in St. Louis, Vincent spent a lot of time at the art galleries in St. Louis, especially the City Art Museum, where he learned to really appreciate art. He also got a lot of art books from his sisters growing up, and he would kind of collect these books and look through them. In fact, while he was visiting a gallery in St. Louis, he actually came across this Rembrandt sketching that I got pictured here, the Rembrandt sketching titled Two Nude Models, One Standing. And when Vincent saw that, he was absolutely captivated by it. But the piece cost $37.50, and at that time, he didn't really have that much money. Well, he went up to the art dealer and told him, look, I've got $5 here. I will put this down and I will work the entire year saving up money so I can pay this off in installments if you'll let me. Of course, the art dealer knew that the Price family was a pretty prominent St. Louis family. He figured he'd be good for it. And Vincent did work the entire year, earning money, doing little odd jobs, saving up his allowance, and he was able to purchase that piece of art. And then as for acting, he actually had his first little role when he was 3 years old in one of his sister's school plays. Now, at that time, he was just supposed to be almost more of a prop, really, than an actor. They just needed a little boy with blonde, curly hair to play a water sprite. But Vincent, even at age 3, was a bit of a ham. He kind of ran around the stage ad-libbing lines. much to the frustration of the other children in the play, but he ended up stealing the show because of it. And after that, as they were growing up, he would continue to perform small plays with his friends for their families. However, when he was finished with high school, he decided to go to college, and he followed in the family tradition of going to Yale. His father, his grandfather had all gone to Yale, and he went to Yale and majored in English with a minor in art history. Then, after he finished up with his undergraduate studies, he moved on to the Courtauld Institute in London to pursue a graduate degree in art history. However, while he was in London, he also really took to the London theaters. He was constantly going out to see these plays, and he got to know the theater crowd fairly well. Well, kind of on a dare, some of his friends decided to provoke him and say, yeah, you should apply to do a part in this upcoming play called Chicago. Now, Vincent, he got the part, and he insisted that the only reason he got the part was that he could talk and chew gum at the same time. Chewing gum wasn't very popular in Britain, so any British actors trying to do it ended up with chewing gum flying across the stage. After that, he then applied to be in a play called Victoria Regina. And this play was a smash hit. It was absolutely one of the top plays of 1935 in London. And part of that was because of Vincent Price. You know, he had kind of a similar build to Prince Albert. Vincent was 6'4" tall. He was a very tall fellow, and he also kind of looked like Prince Albert. Plus, due to some time he'd spent in Germany, he was able to affect a pretty reasonable German accent. Vincent actually had studied German previously, and in order to help kind of get himself into the mindset of Prince Albert, he even had his lines in the script translated into German so that he would be thinking the lines as Prince Albert would have. His performance in Victoria Regina in London was so impressive that when the Broadway producers saw the performance and wanted to have it brought over to Broadway, the fellow who wrote the play himself, Lawrence Hausman, he told them, look, I'm only going to let Broadway have this play if you all take Vincent Price with you. Well, they accepted that, and Vincent ended up getting his first American production done on the Broadway stage. Now, he performed with a woman named Helen Hayes as the queen, and Helen was a pretty well-known name in Broadway at that time, and he formed a very close friendship with Helen. Now, after the play was over with, he got into this film in Hollywood, Service Deluxe. Now, he wasn't a big fan of this film. He thought it was a pretty terrible film, but for the most part, it was fairly standard fare. It didn't get any negative reviews or anything like that. After the film was over, he was offered a contract for $1 million to continue starring in several other films. But he was a little on the fence about it, so he turned to his friend Helen Hayes from back in his acting days with Victoria Regina and asked her, what she thought about it. Well, she ended up giving him some advice that he would really take to heart. She said, well, do you know your craft? If you don't want to be just another flash in the pan, you should really kind of hone in your craft acting before you start moving to more of a film. So rather than going into film, rather than taking the contract, he instead went back to Broadway, and he also started doing summer stock theater. Some of the theatrical performances he did were really, really well received. Others he actually got panned in. But over the course of both the highs and the lows, he really learned the craft of acting. Then once he had felt a little bit more confident in his acting, he returned for the film The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex. Now, Elizabeth and Essex, that was a period drama. Service Deluxe here, that was a romantic comedy. He wasn't really doing any character acting at this time. And honestly, a lot of people thought initially that he was going to end up more of a matinee idol. However, today, horror is what he's really most well known for. Now, his first brush with horror was in 1939's Tower of London, and that film wasn't so much a horror as it was a period drama that had horrific elements to it, though it did give him the chance to star with both Basil Rathbone and Boris Karloff, who would become lifelong friends with. And then in 1940, he was in Return of the Invisible Man. Now, Return of the Invisible Man was less horror than the first film was, and more of a sci-fi thriller, really. But it did kind of give him a bit of a brush with playing in that genre. However, according to his daughter's biography that she wrote about him, Victoria Price, she noted that less than a third of the films he played in were actually horror films, and he was in over 100 films. In fact, the primary film they tended to appear in was historic dramas, the occasional rom-com. He was even in a couple of westerns, including one rather interesting piece called The Baron of Arizona, which the central character was an actual Missourian who tried to claim he owned the entirety of the Arizona territory from the US government back in the early 1800s. Now, his horror status really took off, though, with 1953's House of Wax. Now, this film really made a lot of waves because it was the first color film filmed in 3D. And while it was filmed in 3D, the gimmick wasn't overly used. Vincent credited that to the fact that the director who made the film only had one eye, and so he couldn't see the 3D effect, so he used it kind of sparingly. So it didn't feel like a gimmick just throwing 3D in your face every chance it got. Now, in this film, he used his unique voice to create this debonair and malevolent villain, which would become a trademark for a lot of his characters. Of course, his villains, though, are often very sympathetic characters. They're victims of the world striking back at their fate. Actually, he had a really good quote about the characters he tended to play. Now, he said, "I don't play monsters. I play men besieged by fate and out for revenge." Now, this film started kind of getting him associated with the horror genre, but after the film came out, he ended up not working for almost a year. And that was because, unfortunately, he got gray listed at that time. Of course, 1953, that's right in the middle of the Red Scare. And McCarthy was really hammering down on Hollywood for anyone who might have been listed as a communist or communist sympathizer. Now, Vincent Price, he didn't find himself getting blacklisted, but he got what was called gray listed. He was put on a list of premature anti-Nazi sympathizers. They basically said he was against the Nazis before the US went to war with him, so he might be a communist. Kind of an interesting list to end up on, and he shared it with good company. He was also on that list with Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady. But of course, being gray listed, Hollywood directors and producers weren't sure if he wouldn't end up being blacklisted, and they didn't want to start a picture with him in it only to find out they suddenly couldn't continue the film with him in it. So they were refusing to give him any work. By 1954, Vincent was getting kind of desperate, so he decided to voluntarily go before the FBI to have an interview to be cleared of any ties to communists. Well, the FBI interview did clear him of it. They even provided papers to show that, they'd looked into him and decided he was not a communist or a communist sympathizer. And he would keep those documents with him for the rest of his life, just in case he were ever accused and graylisted again. As I said, after 1953, he really started moving into more antagonistic roles. And part of that was, well, per his daughter's biography that she wrote on him, he was very, very fearful of losing work again. He started taking any role that was offered to him just so long as he was able to keep working so he could keep providing for his family. Of course, not all of those roles were negative. He ended up as the Taskmaster Baca and Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, so he got a little bit away from horror there, even though he's still playing the heavy. And he ended up in some rather interesting kind of gimmick films directed by William Castle. Now, of course, House on Haunted Hill is one of his most well-known pictures. Lots and lots of people know that one, but not many people realize it was actually done with a gimmick in mind. So William Castle, he intended for that film to be played in a theater, and the theater would have what he called emergo is the name of the gimmick he came up for this one. And that they had a system of pulleys around the ceiling in the theater. So that way, when the scene came up where a skeleton comes marching towards his character's wife, they'd have a plastic skeleton flying around the inside of the theater. The audiences just lost their minds when that happened. He was in a second Castle film that involved a gimmick This film was the Tingler. And in the Tingler, there's this monster that causes a tingling sensation to kind of run up your spine. So in order to kind of emulate that, William Castle had theaters set up, not all the seats, but a number of the seats kind of interspersed throughout the theater with these little airplane de-icing motors. So that way, when the monster's tingling sensation was going up the character spine, the motor would go off in the seats, and people were jumping out of their seats, flying out of the theaters for that. Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of stuff like that today, but it must have been quite the experience going to the theater with those films. Now, his horse Sasso was really kind of solidified with the Edgar Allan Poe films. After the Poe films, he kind of really became known as the King of Horror. Now, the Poe films were shot for American International Productions with director Roger Corman back in the 1960s. And they did what they called it the Poe cycle. I think they did something like 7, 8 different films. Let's see here. We had a House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, The Raven, The Haunted Palace, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Tomb of Ligeia. Now, these films were very, very popular in the drive-in theater scene because a lot of the kids going out there wanted to take their dates out, see the scary movie. And because of all the kids going out to see these films in the drive-in theaters, Vincent Price, even though he was now in his 50s, suddenly found he had a very young audience. He had this massive fan base amongst the youth at that time, which was kind of unusual for an actor his age. So he was really, really grateful to these films, even though at times the films got a little campy. I think they said that they did the first 2 intentionally seriously. The next 2, they decided to really play up the camp and make them almost more of a horror comedy. And by the last 2, they'd kind of return back to the serious tone. Now, not all of the films are actually based on the work of Poe. All of them just kind of had Poe's name put on them because of how popular the Poe films were becoming. For example, The Haunted Palace, that's the name of one of Edgar Allan Poe's poems, but the story itself is actually based on an old H.P. Lovecraft story. And that was pretty common fare for American International Pictures. Once they realized, oh, these Poe films are super popular, they'd slap a Poe title on any film, regardless of how true it was to the subject matter. For example, they released a film called The Conqueror Worm, which was one of Poe's poems, but it was actually a historic drama based on the Witchfinder General from Oliver Cromwell's reign. Of course, Vincent Price, he was not afraid to ham it up outside of those, serious horror movies. For example, in Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine, he was playing this kind of goofy spoof on a lot of those old James Bond films that were really popular at the time. That one specifically was a spoof on Dr. No and Goldfinger. He also made a lot of TV appearances, kind of playing campy characters. Like we've got Egghead here from the old Adam West Batman series, in which he would make these extremely bad puns and use egg-themed weaponry. And there's the image here from his appearance on the Muppet Show, which is one that shows up on Facebook a lot around Halloween. He was able to kind of keep that horror image while still camping it up enough that the kids were able to get a laugh out of it. Of course, he did try to maintain a live theater presence as well. He really enjoyed performing in live theater, and he'd often do live theater in between film shoots. Especially early on in his career, he regularly did the summer stock theater, and for the brief time that I was around, he was part of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater. Now, a number of those shows actually made it to Broadway, such as Angel Street. A number of them were panned, not very good. But he often claimed that the best performance of his entire life was given when he did the one-man play, Diversions and Delights. Now, this was a play he did later on in life when he was trying to reclaim kind of his acting chops after, being in all these campy horror films for so many years. And in this show, he's on stage by himself playing a aging Oscar Wilde, who's just been released from prison and is going on a lecture tour to try and raise up some money. Now, while it's claimed that this is the best performance of his life, unfortunately, it was never recorded. Well, not on film, anyways. There is actually an audio recording of it, though, which you can find on YouTube, so you can still hear him performing the part, even if, unfortunately, we can't see him in the part. Now, at the end of his career, he was still putting out work that had broad appeal to all ages. And of course, like I said, I'm an older millennial. I recognize him from Edward Scissorhands, The Rap, and Michael Jackson's Thriller. And I didn't know at that time, but he's even in Walt Disney's The Great Mouse Detective as the villain from that movie. So, like I said, he's putting out stuff that was recognized by people young and old throughout his entire career. And that career spanned 57 years. Now, his final credited role was in 1992's TV film, The Heart of Justice, though the last film that would end up on the big screen was Edward Scissorhands. Of course, like I said, one of his big passions was art, and throughout his career, he continued to try to bring that in. He didn't ever make it as an art historian, but he became a lifelong collector and a proponent for the arts. Like I said, in 1933, he graduated Yale with a degree in English and a minor in art history. And then from there, he would go to the Courtauld Institute to try to study art history. But he ended up starting his acting career a year later, so he didn't end up staying at the Courtauld. And a fact I found rather interesting is Vincent was so interested in art history, but he was actually colorblind, which I imagine was quite the challenge for him in studying art. And his colorblindness was so severe that when he tried to join the Navy during World War II, he was actually denied entry into the Navy due to how severe the colorblindness was. Now, rather than being a historian, he became a collector, and he would often joke that he'd take some of these terrible acting roles just to enjoy the local art dealers and the place where they're setting up the shoot for the film. Now, one of the fun quotes I found from him was, "I made some dreadful pictures in Italy. They were terrible, but I bought so much good art." Though he was especially fond of Native American art, actually. So much so, and he was recognized as such an expert in Native American art, that he was asked to serve on the board for the Indian Arts and Crafts Board for the Department of the Interior for 14 years. He even served as the chair of the board from 1967 to 1972. And while he was on the board, he would tour across the country helping to promote and support Native American art. And then when he finally left the Native American Arts and Crafts Board, according to a Native American artist, Oscar Howe, Vincent actually petitioned to have his position filled by a Native American because he didn't just want to speak for them. He wanted them to be able to speak for themselves on their arts and crafts. Now, this wouldn't be the only time he worked for the government to help with the arts. He was actually asked by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy to serve on the White House Commission on Fine Art when she was getting ready to redecorate the White House. He served on that committee under both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations. And he served as an advisor to kind of help them pick out some of the best pieces of art from the different eras of American history to kind of help keep a united theme throughout the White House. He was so honored by this opportunity that he and his wife Mary decided to donate a piece of artwork from their personal collection to the White House. Now, after President Kennedy was assassinated, Jacqueline Kennedy later confided to him that President Kennedy had loved that painting in specific so much that he hung it up at the foot of his bed so it'd be the first thing he saw every morning when he woke up. Now, Vincent, he used his celebrity status, of course, to help push for a greater art appreciation for the everyday person as well. The public first really became aware of his art advocacy and expertise in 1956 through this game show called the $64,000 Challenge. That was kind of a spin-off of the original $64,000 question. And in this show, he would be pitted up against another person who would claim to be an expert in the field. So the show's premise really was, Okay, you say you're an expert in this field. We're going to quiz you on these topics that you say you're an expert in. And he was being pitted up against a jockey named Eddie Robinson to see who was the most knowledgeable about art. However, he quipped at one point during this series, you don't need $64,000 to be a collector or to enjoy art. It doesn't cost 64 cents to go to a museum. Now, unfortunately, in 1959, his association with the $64,000 challenge really kind of came to end because the game show rigging scandal broke. Turned out a number of these game shows across different networks, not necessarily the $64,000 challenge, but several other game shows had been rigging their contests to try to drive up a public engagement and interest. Now, Vincent himself came out of the scandal fairly unscathed. He actually testified before a grand jury to his innocence, but it did leave a bit of a bad taste in his mouth. Not enough so that he wouldn't continue to do game shows. He would regularly talk on TV talk shows, make appearances on game shows, and he'd also travel around the country lecturing at universities about art. And probably one of the clips of some of his best humor you'll find are clips from him on Hollywood Squares. He really let his humor out for Hollywood Squares, and I believe he was in over 900 episodes of Hollywood Squares. Now, Vincent really felt that there was this misconception among the public that art was only for the very wealthy. He wanted to help make it accessible to everyone. And given his reputation for being knowledgeable about art, when Sears, Roebuck and Company decided to put together a collection of art to sell in their stores, they decided to contact him to kind of be the spokesperson. Now, at first, Vincent was a little leery about the idea. He was worried that Sears would be selling this, absolutely awful art or selling prints. So he ultimately told him, okay, look, I'll agree to do this, but only if I get to be the one picking out the art. So that way, any art sold under my name is guaranteed to be top quality stuff, and it's guaranteed to be an original. They agreed to that, and between, 1962 and 1971, he regularly would travel across the world buying pieces of art to be sold at Sears. Now, the artworks that Sears was selling, they could be purchased for anywhere between $10 and $3,000, and they could be paid for in installments. And they weren't just selling, little known names. They're selling Goyas, Rembrandts. They're selling some fairly well known artists at these showings. Now, Sears, of course, they did a test run before they started it full on. They said, okay, our Denver store is going to be the first store to have a showing. Vincent Price showed up with that, and that night they sold out of every single painting they had on the showing and had to send trucks to their warehouses kind of as an emergency. We need more art to show for the next day. Between 1962 and 71, over 50,000 pieces of art would be sold through the Sears Vincent Price collection. And he personally guaranteed the quality of the artwork, while his wife Mary was actually the one who designed all the frames for each piece of art. And in order to help associates learn how to sell the art to the public, Vincent even put together a little video kind of talking about the collection and what associates would need to know in order to help sell that. And you can find that video on YouTube still. Now, for over 30 years, Vincent would give lectures on art at universities, including a number of university lectures at Truman State University in Kirksville. He really felt that, students, though, they needed to immerse themselves in the art in order to really understand it. Just talking about it wasn't enough. So in 1957, he and his wife Mary decided to donate a massive collection of art to the East Los Angeles College. This would eventually become the foundation for the Vincent Price Art Museum at East Los Angeles College. So from their personal collection, they initially donated 90 pieces, and they would add more as they went. And that museum is still open today. It is free and open. I'm not sure about free, but it is open to the public for both students and the community to learn about art through the firsthand experience with the pieces that they curate. And of course, in addition to food, Vincent was a collector of recipes. Like I said, he had a very strong family connection with food to begin with, but he absolutely loved to cook, both for himself and for friends. And whenever he was out traveling about, if he ate something at a restaurant that he really enjoyed, it wasn't uncommon for him to call the chef up and ask him to teach him how to cook that recipe. Of course, Vincent Price did his best to kind of spread his love of cooking around as well. So he was asked to advertise for the bitters company here, and he decided, okay, well, yeah, the bitters are primarily used for drinks, but here's a dish you can make using those bitters. So he'd put recipes for these bitters in his advertisements for the company. Now, of course, he wasn't just eating fine dining either. They've got beef Wellington here. You think, okay, that's a pretty fancy dish, but actually, one of his favorite dishes was the hot dog from Dodger Stadium. The old Dodgers dog. I believe he actually included a recipe for that in one of his cookbooks. Of course, Vincent Price, being a bit of a ham character actor, he had to ham it up even when he was talking about food. One of the most famous instances of that is in 1975, he cooked a trout in a dishwasher for the Johnny Carson show. Now, that segment is entirely on YouTube. They've got a short version and the longer version. If you decide to go looking for it, though, I really recommend going for the longer 20-minute segment, as it's absolutely hilarious. Now, beforehand, he talks to Johnny Carson, of course, about art and acting, and he talks a little bit about cooking, and he tells him, you know what, I've got a surprise for you. They bring it over to the set. He's got all the ingredients laid out, so he kind of goes through how to prepare the dish in front of the live audience. But then they turn around and wheel out this dishwasher that had been run just before the segment so they could show that he'd actually cooked the fish in the dishwasher. But it's definitely worth checking out. It's absolutely hilarious. He was also one of the early celebrities to get their own cooking show. Unfortunately, it was only aired in the United Kingdom, and I can't find any episodes online anywhere, so I'm not sure that there's any preserved copies of the actual video. Though they did actually release a cookbook with the show's same title, Cooking Price-Wise, and you can still find copies of that cookbook online. So, the United Kingdom BBC, they decided to set him up with the show because he'd really become known as gourmand by this point. And their idea for the show was, okay, a lot about really fancy dishes, a lot of exotic cuisine. Can we cook that here using the ingredients that can be bought at the local grocery store? So before they would cook a dish, Vincent would go out to these little local grocery stores around England, make sure that they had all the ingredients, and then he would go over step by step how to produce some of these really high-end dishes or really exotic sounding dishes, because he felt, you don't have to be rich to eat really fancy food. You don't have to go travel to these exotic locations. You can do these things from the things in your local grocery store. And like I said, that cookbook, it was released. He actually released a couple of cookbooks. Here's just a selection of some of them. We call it Come Into the Kitchen cookbook, released by him and his wife, Mary. Actually, most of the cookbooks, both him and Mary were involved with. A Treasury of Great Recipes, though, that one was kind of a kitchen staple for a lot of Americans. It was a very popular cookbook. And I believe that's the one that has that Dodgers dog recipe in it, if you're interested. And his wife, Mary, also looked into a little bit of the history of cooking. That's what we've got with the National Treasury of Cookery. That's a 5-series cookbook talking about different eras in American cooking. So like we've got Victorian America up front here. There's also one for colonial America. And then, like I said, the Cooking Price-Wise cookbook was the companion cookbook to the celebrity cooking show that he had while he was in England. So Vincent, his legacy is quite the lasting one. His influence is wide-reaching, and it's still felt even today. You talk about Vincent Price, it's a name most people recognize, and they will say, oh yeah, he's great at all these horror films. He's really kind of known as the king of horror films. However, his other passions would definitely come to influence the world, even if more subtly. Like I said, his treasury of great recipes was a mainstay in countless homes throughout America. A lot of people used that old cookbook. And thankfully, through the efforts of his daughter, Victoria, a lot of those cookbooks have been recently reprinted. So while the original copies are now collector's items that can sell for over $500, you can get a reprinted copy of like a Treasury of Great Recipes for about $40-50 on Amazon. Also, countless Americans would end up acquiring fine art for their home through his work with Sears. So he did fairly successfully get a lot of artwork out into the everyday person. It's not just sitting in private collections like he was afraid of. And of course, the students at East Los Angeles College and art lovers just in general are able to, they've got the opportunity to study and really kind of immerse themselves in the original pieces of art that he donated to that museum. Now, does anyone have any questions at this time?
Okay. Yeah, please feel free to include any questions in the chat. I actually was searching our catalog. We don't currently have any Vincent Price cookbooks in our collection.
Oh,
But
that's unfortunate. But like I said, they're all on Amazon. It would be worth considering. And I'd also really recommend Victoria Price's biography, Vincent Price, A Daughter's Biography. It's an excellent book. She did a ton of research into Vincent Price, interviewed a lot of his old friends. She actually had a number of his documents from after he passed. It's a great read. It's really easy to read too.
well, that's not to say we can't get it through interlibrary loan. Yeah. Okay, I think we've got a question here. Do you know what happened to the painting that he gave to JFK in the White House?
As far as I know, it is still in the White House. So those were meant to be kind of permanently for the White House rather than the Kennedys themselves.
Okay, fascinating talk. Thank you. Was there a cookbook to go along with his thriller fame?
Unfortunately, no cookbook to go along with Thriller. And unfortunately, Vincent himself was kind of burned by Thriller because he didn't end up getting any royalties for that. He kind of felt that Michael Jackson had, said, "Oh, you get a little honorarium," but then it ended up being the best-selling album of all time. And when Vincent tried to get a little bit of money for his work on Thriller, Jackson's legal team refused to let him get any of it. So he really felt kind of burned by Michael Jackson with the Thriller, but he did actually a number of work for other artists as well. He was the narrator for Alice Cooper and oh the Black Widow album. He also worked with Deep Purple a little bit, and he considered Gene Simmons from Kiss one of his friends.
Okay, here's a comment. He was also the saint on radio.
Yes, he was. He did quite a bit of radio work actually. So he's did a series called The Price of Fear, in which he would narrate these short, scary stories. The Saint he did for a number of years, I believe, from the late 40s, early 50s. He did quite a bit of voice work as well. And I checked Audible a couple weeks back, and there are a number of books that he narrated as well as audiobooks.
Okay, did Vincent Price win any acting awards?
He did win a number of awards. He, get the occasional Grammy, things like that. He did get nominated for a number of Oscars as well, but those tended to be for some of the bigger works that he did. And a lot more of the awards he ended up getting, I believe, were actually through Broadway, through his work on like Angel Street, especially, was a very popular one.
Okay, his daughter has come to our Midsummer Scream event here in California.
Oh yeah, she regularly goes out to like horror conventions and any sort of convention about Vincent Price. Now, she herself says she's not a fan of horror movies because, after all, she doesn't like seeing her dad get killed in all these movies, but she says she's a fan of horror fans, and she really tries to work to keep his legacy alive. So she often goes to speak kind of on his behalf.
Okay, thanks so much. Learned so much about this great man, other than his movies scared me to death as a child.
Yeah, I've really been inspired to start rewatching a lot of those old films. I hadn't seen them in years. It's like, oh, I should go and check that one back out again.
We do have a lot of his movies in our collection on DVD. So,
oh yeah, like I said, he did over 100 films. So I'm sure he got quite
yeah,
the collection there.
What was the last project he worked on?
So the last credited role was The Heart of Justice. That was credited in 1992. The last feature film was Edward Scissorhands. And then outside of acting, up until his death, he was working with his daughter on putting together a book on artwork.
off topic, but at the beginning you said you were looking into Missouri Trailblazers. Have you considered doing a talk about the history of animation in KC? Most people know that Walt Disney and his partner I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Iwerks, were from Missouri, but Warner Brothers and MGM alumni like Fritz Freelig, Rudolph Isig, and Hugh Harmon were as well. So do you?
Now, we haven't looked at that topic specifically yet. The Missouri Trailblazers, we were kind of looking at some of the folks who hadn't made it into the Hall of Famous Missourians upstairs, because we're the museum located in the Capitol and Disney is up there. So we tended to look for folks who hadn't made it into the hall just yet. So that is definitely a very interesting topic. I know Disney, especially, a lot of folks, like, I'll tell them if they're on one of the Capitol tours, hey, did you know Disney was from Missouri? They had absolutely no idea. He grew up in Marceline, set up a Laugh-O-Gram Studios out in Kansas City. It's a very interesting subject and definitely one that I think would make a really good program.
I actually went on a road trip up to Marceline and went through the museum, and then you could visit the site of his home, and it was very interesting. So if you're local to Missouri, I would recommend a road trip to Marceline, although we're getting off topic. Okay, any more questions? We've got time if you have more questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. You know what, did I put my link to the survey in there? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put my link to the survey in the chat right now. If you could open up that link, and we would appreciate it if you took a moment to fill that out. Lucas, if no one has any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you so much for your time and your interesting program. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. I really enjoyed researching the topic, and I hope you all enjoyed hearing a little bit about him.
Whoops. Oh, a couple more. Thanks so much. Oh, thank you for the interesting presentation. Okay, I wanted to get those in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say good night, everybody. Please feel free to join us for future programs, and hopefully we'll have Lucas back. Look forward to it. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.